see this as a euphemism for an excuse to spy on First Nations when they exercise their collective and individual rights. Our people could find themselves under increasing surveillance because of the broad, vague concepts and activities covered by this phrase. It clearly goes way beyond the current criminal code definition of terrorist activity. The "for greater certainty" clause that excludes lawful advocacy, protest, dissent, and artistic expression is not adequate to deal with complexities of the ongoing task of reconciling First Nations law and jurisdiction with Canada's asserted sovereignty. This government often invokes the rule of law. We would like some rule of law that respects our Constitution, our constitutionally protected rights, and our fundamental human rights. The days are gone when absolute parliamentary supremacy trumps human rights and First Nations rights. But we still see this government struggling to accept the Constitution Act of 1982, both Part 1, the Charter, and Part 2, which recognizes and affirms our treaty and Aboriginal rights. Both sets of rights are at stake in Bill C51. First Nations maintain that Bill C51 will infringe our freedom of speech and assembly, our right to be free of unreasonable search and seizure, our right to liberty, our fundamental rights as peoples under Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, our treaty rights, and our right to self-determination. Our right to self-determination, recognized in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, includes the right to protect and make decisions about activities and laws affecting our lands and waters. But there is a balance between rights and security, and we can find it through dialogue with one another as nations. Unfortunately, the process for developing this legislation did not meet the federal government's duty to consult and accommodate, and on that point alone is subject to challenge in the courts if the government tries to impose it on us. Bill C51 sets up conditions for conflict by creating conditions where our people will be labeled as threats to critical infrastructure or the economic stability of Canada when asserting their individual or collective rights as First Nation citizens. This is not an abstract argument for our people. We've been labeled as terrorists when we stand up for our rights and our lands and our waters. We can see how First Nations have been lumped in with terrorists and violent extremists when they are asserting their fundamental rights and jurisdiction, as in the recently leaked RCMP memo entitled Criminal Threats to the Canadian Petroleum Industry. I'll be submitting this report as part of this presentation. First Nations have an unmatched record as peaceful peoples in the face of the most appalling human rights abuses, which is particularly exceptional when we remember the unrelenting assaults on our values, laws, jurisdiction, and fundamental human rights. We are peace-loving peoples, but we will push back against assaults on our most basic liberties. We stand with the many other Canadians who are not willing to forfeit their fundamental rights and freedoms, who are demanding that this government engage in more careful crafting of important legislation. Canada must do better and must do more to meet its constitutional and treaty responsibilities to First Nations. I leave you with a statement directed not just at this committee but to all Canadians. First Nations know better than anyone how easy it is for government to ignore, erode, and eradicate our most basic human rights and freedoms until you barely recognize the land you're living in. First Nations deserve better. Canadians deserve better. We cannot turn back. We cannot turn our backs on our hard-won human rights, and we cannot turn our back on the Indigenous rights. Treaties and title on which this country is founded, we can do better and we must do better. First Nations will vigorously oppose any legislation that does not respect and protect our rights. First Nations will stand up for the rights of our people and our responsibilities to our traditional territories. We make the following recommendations. Number one, that the government withdraw the bill and consult properly with First Nations about its impact on our rights. And number two, that the government discuss with First Nations options for a review process to examine all federal legislation that can impact the assertion of our Section 35 rights. Thank you.
Thank you.